This is the story of Nagini, not just the deadliest Horcrux ever created, but of a woman who irreversibly lost her humanity. If you're ready to dive into the darkest secrets of the Harry Potter universe, subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. Today, we'll unravel not only who Nagini was before becoming a serpent, but how her transformation directly connects with events that shaped the destiny of the wizarding world for decades. Prepare yourself for a narrative that goes far beyond what the film showed. Our story begins in the 1920s, a time of cultural and magical effervescence. Nagini wasn't born as a serpent. She was a woman, a maledictus, bearer of a hereditary curse that was transmitted exclusively through the female bloodline. But before darkness consumed her life, she lived moments of pure magic and freedom. At the height of the 20s, when the world was still recovering from the Great War, magical circuses traveled through Europe, offering spectacles that defied both the laws of physics and traditional magic. The Circus Arcanus was the most famous of them, a company that gathered extraordinary creatures and people under the direction of the enigmatic Sender. Nagini was the main star of these spectacles. With her unique ability to temporarily transform into a gigantic serpent, she mesmerized entire audiences. But what few knew is that each transformation brought her closer to the moment when she could no longer return to human form. It was a death sentence, disguised as a gift. It was during a performance in Paris that Nagini met Credence Barebone, or as we would discover later, Aurelius Dumbledore. Two beings marked by destiny. Two souls carrying burdens impossible to comprehend. Credence, an adult obscurial, a parasitic and destructive magical force that emerges when magical abilities are suppressed, usually through physical or psychological abuse, whose very existence defied everything known about suppressed magic. Found in Nagini, not just an ally, but someone who understood the weight of carrying a curse in the blood. The connection between them transcended the romantic. It was a union of condemned souls who found comfort in one another. While Credence fought against the darkness growing within him, Nagini waged her own battle against time, knowing that each day brought her closer to losing her humanity forever. To truly understand Nagini's tragedy, we need to dive into the science behind the maledictus curse. Unlike animagi who choose to learn to transform, or werewolves who are infected by bite, the maledictus are born with a blood curse that eventually consumes them completely. The curse follows specific patterns. It affects only women, is hereditary, and progressive. With each transformation, the person loses a bit more of their human essence, until one day, the transformation becomes permanent. It's like a magical hourglass. You can turn it several times, but the grains of sand of humanity keep falling, and there's no way to recover them. In Nagini's case, the curse manifested in the form of a serpent, specifically a viper of gigantic proportions. This wasn't a coincidence. Maledict's curses frequently reflect characteristics of the cursed person's personality or destiny. The serpent represented not just danger, but also ancestral knowledge, medicine, poison that can heal or kill, and a primordial connection with ancient magical forces. During the 1920s and 1930s, those close to Nagini began to notice worrying changes. Her transformations lasted increasingly longer. Her body temperature fluctuated drastically. Her eyes, even in human form, occasionally showed vertical pupils. More alarming still, she began to demonstrate serpentine behaviors even when she was human. A preference for heat, more fluid movements, and a growing capacity to detect vibrations in the air. The most tragic was her awareness of the process. Unlike a sudden transformation, Nagini lived for years knowing exactly what she was losing day after day. Imagine waking up each morning knowing that you are a little less human than the day before, and that eventually a day will come when you simply won't wake up as yourself again. The 1930s brought seismic changes to the European magical world. Glet Grindelwald, the most powerful dark wizard before Voldemort, initiated his campaign to establish a new world order where wizards would rule over muggles for the greater good. His influence spread like a plague, infecting minds with promises of power and superiority. The Circus Arcanus, with its collection of different magical beings, became a natural target for Grindelwald's ideologies. People like Nagini and Credence, marginalized by traditional magical society, were exactly the type of follower the Dark Wizard sought. Desperate, powerful, and with little to lose. Grindelwald didn't recruit Nagini through brute force or intimidation. Instead, he offered something much more seductive: hope. He claimed to possess knowledge about ancient curses, suggesting that in his new world order, resources would be dedicated to finding cures for conditions like the Maledictus curse. For someone facing a magical death sentence, this promise was irresistible. Nagini didn't join Grindelwald out of malice, but out of desperation. The same desperation that Voldemort would later exploit, but in an even crueler way. There is evidence that Nagini's final transformation occurred during the tumultuous events of the late 1930s or early 1940s. Some researchers speculate that the emotional stress of losing Credence, whether by death or separation, may have accelerated the transformation process. Imagine the horror. One morning, Nagini woke up in serpent form and simply could no longer return. There was no ceremony, no farewell to humanity. One day, she was a woman fighting against a curse. The next, she was permanently what the curse wanted her to become. Between her final transformation, estimated between 1937 to 1942, and her first encounter with Tom Riddle, which would be around 1940-1950. Nagini lived decades as a giant serpent, but with fragments of human memories still echoing in her transformed mind. During this period, she developed extraordinary serpentine abilities. Her venom became lethal, not just physically, but also magically, capable of leaving wounds that resisted even the most powerful healing magics. Her capacity to move silently, even with her gigantic size, made her an almost ghostly predator. But perhaps the most significant ability she developed was a primitive form of legitimacy: the ability to read minds. In her serpentine form, this manifested as an ability to detect fears, desires, and weaknesses in her prey. It was as if her lost humanity had transformed into a psychological hunting tool. Rare reports from wizards who encountered Nagini during these lost years described strange behaviors. She was sometimes seen remaining motionless for hours near locations where circuses had camped, as if still searching for something familiar. Others reported that she seemed to recognize specific music, particularly circus melodies from the 1920s. Most disturbing were the moments when she seemed to try to communicate something beyond aggression or hunger. Witnesses described a type of lament, not a sound that a normal serpent would make, but something almost human in its despair. It was as if, buried under layers of animal instinct, a part of Nagini still struggled to emerge. Tom Marvel Riddle, still years before fully adopting the identity of Lord Voldemort, was in constant search for artifacts and knowledge that could increase his power. In the late 1940s, during his travels through Europe and Asia in search of ancestral dark magic, he heard rumors about a giant serpent in Albania that possessed extraordinary magical characteristics. Albania had always been a place of refuge for dangerous magical creatures and banned magic. It was the perfect location for someone like Nagini to exist without being constantly hunted or studied by the Ministry of Magic. When Riddle finally found her, he immediately realized that he wasn't dealing with an ordinary serpent. The first encounter between Riddle and Nagini was paradoxically based on mutual respect. Riddle, being a parselmouth, could communicate directly with her, and it was through this communication that he discovered Nagini's true nature. She wasn't just a magical serpent. She was a person who had lost her humanity due to an ancestral curse. For Riddle, this represented a unique opportunity. Nagini wasn't just a pet or bodyguard. She was an ally who understood both human and animal nature. She could think strategically, but also could act with the instinctive cruelty of a natural predator. For Nagini, Riddle represented something she hadn't experienced in decades: intellectual communication. For the first time since her transformation, she could express complex thoughts and be understood. It was a cruel form of relief. Finally, someone to talk to, even though that someone was one of the most dangerous beings in the magical world. Riddle didn't simply dominate Nagini through force or coercion. Instead, he offered her something she desperately desired: purpose. Decades of primitive existence had left Nagini in a state of profound existential depression. She had lost her humanity, but maintained enough intelligence to suffer from this loss. Riddle offered her not just a role in his plans, but a renewed identity. She would be more than a serpent. She would be an extension of his will, a partner in his quest for absolute power. In return, he promised that together they would transcend the limitations of both humanity and mortality. The decision to transform Nagini into a Horcrux wasn't made impulsively. Riddle, already beginning to identify more as Lord Voldemort, spent years studying the implications of using a living being as a receptacle for a fragment of his soul. Ancient books suggested that living creatures could offer unique advantages as Horcruxes. They could defend themselves, move independently, and even act on behalf of the Horcrux's creator. But using Nagini had specific risks. Unlike inanimate objects, she maintained her own consciousness and will. The transformation process into a Horcrux could completely destroy what remained of her original personality, or worse, could create an internal conflict that would make the Horcrux unstable. To create any Horcrux, it's necessary to commit murder, the most vile act possible, which literally splits the murderer's soul. For Nagini's Horcrux, Voldemort chose a particularly significant victim: Bertha Jorkins, a Ministry of Magic employee who had discovered information about his return. The murder of Bertha Jorkins was particularly cruel, not just because it resulted in a death, but because Voldemort used Nagini as the instrument of death. This created a triple connection. Voldemort committed the murder. Nagini was the means by which it was executed, and the fragment of Voldemort's soul was then implanted in the serpent that had just killed in his name. The transformation process was different from any other Horcrux creation in history. When the fragment of Voldemort's soul lodged in Nagini, it didn't simply hide inside her. It merged with her own transformed consciousness. The result was an entity that was simultaneously Nagini and Voldemort, but also something completely new. This fusion explained the extraordinary connection between them. Nagini didn't just obey Voldemort. She understood his thoughts, anticipated his needs, and shared his emotions. When Voldemort felt anger, Nagini became more aggressive. When he was planning, she demonstrated a supernatural patience. During Voldemort's rise to power, Nagini became much more than a pet. She was a lethal extension of his will. Her presence at Death Eater meetings wasn't just intimidating. It was strategic. She could detect lies, fear, or hesitation in ways that even Voldemort sometimes didn't perceive. Nagini developed a unique behavioral pattern during executions. She didn't just kill quickly. She studied her victims first, as if reading their souls before destroying their bodies. Surviving witnesses described that she seemed to savor not just physical fear, but also the emotional despair of her prey. The murder of Frank Bryce in Little Hangleton was particularly significant. Nagini didn't just execute the elderly man. She did it in a way that sent a clear message to Harry Potter. The venom she injected into Bryce didn't just kill him. It created a psychic impression that Harry, through his connection with Voldemort, could experience in vivid detail. Later, the murder of Snape in the Shrieking Shack demonstrated the level of strategic precision that Nagini had developed. Voldemort didn't instruct her simply to kill Snape quickly. He needed the death to seem like a logical consequence of the war, not a planned execution. Nagini executed the murder in a way that preserved the illusion that Snape had died for loyalty, not for discovered betrayal. During these years of terror, Nagini developed abilities that went far beyond what any natural serpent could possess. She learned to move through magical protection systems without activating them, as if her dual nature as a living creature and magical object made her invisible to certain forms of detection. Her ability to locate specific people became almost supernatural. It wasn't just by smell or body heat. She could track people through emotional connections, shared memories, and even through the residual magic that all wizards leave behind. The discovery that Harry Potter carried a fragment of Voldemort's soul created a unique dynamic between him and Nagini. Both were Horcruxes, but of completely different natures. Harry carried the fragment involuntarily and unconsciously, while Nagini had been deliberately transformed to serve this purpose. This connection manifested in strange and disturbing ways. Harry occasionally experienced visions through Nagini's eyes, not just seeing what she saw, but feeling her serpentine emotions. Imagine discovering that for decades you believed you knew only half the story. That the gigantic and lethal serpent that terrorized the wizarding world alongside Lord Voldemort had a past far darker and more tragic than anyone could imagine. This is the story of Nagini. Not just the deadliest Horcrux ever created, but of a woman who irreversibly lost her humanity. If you're ready to dive into the darkest secrets of the Harry Potter universe, it wasn't direct control, but a form of subconscious communication between two parts of the same divided soul. During the final confrontation at Hogwarts, there was a moment of recognition between Harry and Nagini that went beyond simple identification of enemies. For an instant, when their gazes crossed, both recognized the familiar presence of the soul fragment they shared. It was as if two people who had lost memories of a shared trauma suddenly remembered one another. This recognition was simultaneously comforting and terrifying for Harry. Comforting because he finally understood the nature of his connection with Nagini, but terrifying because he realized how easily he could have followed a path similar to hers, becoming an extension of Voldemort's will instead of resisting it. During the Battle of Hogwarts, the destruction of the Horcruxes became a critical priority. Harry, Ron, and Hermione knew that as long as any Horcrux remained intact, Voldemort would be impossible to defeat permanently. Nagini, being a living and mobile Horcrux, presented unique challenges for destruction. Unlike inanimate objects that could be destroyed with basilisk venom or other destructive magical substances, Nagini could actively defend herself. More complicated still, she was frequently close to Voldemort, protected by layers of defensive spells that made approach extremely dangerous. Voldemort had enveloped Nagini in a sphere of magical protection that was almost impenetrable. It wasn't just a physical shield. It was a barrier that specifically repelled objects and spells that could destroy Horcruxes. It was as if he had created an environment where reality itself bent to protect the fragment of his soul. This protection had a cost. Maintaining Nagini in this state of supreme protection constantly drained Voldemort's magical energy. It was one of the reasons why he became more desperate and reckless as the battle progressed. He was literally dividing his attention and power between fighting and protecting his most precious Horcrux. Nagini's final destruction didn't happen through an elaborate plan or complex magic. It happened through the simplest and bravest act possible. Neville Longbottom, wielding the sword of Godric Gryffindor, simply decided that someone had to do what was necessary, regardless of personal cost. The moment of destruction was both tragic and liberating. When the sword cut through Nagini, it didn't just destroy Voldemort's soul fragment. It also finally freed what remained of the woman she had been. For an instant, witnesses reported seeing something almost human in her serpentine eyes, as if the true Nagini was grateful for finally being able to rest. Nagini's death was different from the destruction of other Horcruxes. When inanimate objects were destroyed, they simply ceased to exist. But when Nagini died, there was a moment of peace that observers described as almost spiritual. It was as if decades of suffering, confusion, and fragmented consciousness finally came to an end. Some wizards present at the moment reported feeling a wave of emotion that wasn't their own, a feeling of deep gratitude and relief. It was as if the true Nagini, buried under decades of transformation and corruption, could finally express what she had felt all this time. A desperate desire for all of it to end. Nagini's story is fundamentally about the consequences of having limited choices. She didn't choose to be born with a maledictus curse. She didn't choose to permanently transform into a serpent. And it's argued she didn't really choose to become a Horcrux. She was manipulated into accepting this transformation by someone who exploited her desperation and isolation. This absence of genuine choice makes Nagini one of the most tragic figures in the Harry Potter universe. Unlike characters like, say, Snape or even Draco Malfoy, who made active decisions that led them down dark paths, Nagini was a victim of circumstances beyond her control, from birth to death. Nagini's transformation serves as a powerful metaphor for how society can dehumanize individuals who are different. In the magical world, people like her, curse-bearers, circus members, beings considered non-human, were frequently marginalized and ignored by the magical community. This marginalization created the perfect conditions for predators like Grindelwald and Voldemort to exploit vulnerable people. Nagini didn't become a follower of darkness because she was inherently evil, but because magical society failed to offer her viable alternatives or support during her transformation. One of the most moving aspects of Nagini's story is how she constantly sought genuine connection with other conscious beings. Her relationship with Credence, her communication with Voldemort, and even her strange psychic connection with Harry demonstrate a deep desire not to be alone in her unique and terrible experience. This need for connection is profoundly human, and remained with Nagini even after her physical form became completely serpentine. It suggests that true humanity isn't in physical form, but in the capacity to form meaningful relationships and seek mutual understanding. Nagini's death raises complex questions about redemption and moral responsibility. To what extent was she responsible for her actions as Voldemort's servant? Her victims deserve justice, but she was also, in many ways, a victim. The answer isn't simple, and perhaps it shouldn't be. Nagini's story teaches us that the real world and the magical world are places where victims can become perpetrators, where circumstances can force people to make impossible choices, and where justice and compassion sometimes come into direct conflict. The complete story of Nagini is a reminder that behind every villain, there may be a story of pain, loss, and impossible choices. It forces us to question our perceptions about good and evil, victim and perpetrator, choice and destiny. Nagini lived multiple lives. The cursed woman of the 1920s, the circus artist who found temporary love, the desperate creature searching for a cure, the primitive serpent struggling with human memories, and finally, the conscious Horcrux serving a master who exploited her fragmented nature. Nagini's creation as a character represents an evolution in how antagonists are developed in fantasy literature. She isn't simply a monster to be defeated, but a tragic figure whose narrative arc adds layers of moral complexity to the entire Harry Potter saga. Her story teaches us that understanding our enemies doesn't mean excusing their actions, but recognizing the complex humanity that exists, even in the darkest places. This understanding is crucial not just in literature, but in how we navigate conflicts in the real world. If there's a central lesson in Nagini's story, it's that humanity isn't defined by physical form, but by the capacity to love, suffer, choose, and connect with others. Nagini lost her human form, but maintained elements of humanity until the end. Paradoxically, some of the characters who maintained human form throughout the series demonstrated much less genuine humanity. Nagini's death wasn't just the destruction of a Horcrux. It was the final liberation of a soul that had suffered transformations and manipulations for decades. In her final moments, she was no longer Voldemort's feared serpent, but again, the woman who had been forced to leave her humanity behind. If this journey through Nagini's complete story made you reflect on the moral complexities of the Harry Potter universe, leave your comment below. Which aspect of her transformation impressed you most? And don't forget to subscribe and activate the bell. This is the complete story of Nagini, a narrative of loss, transformation, manipulation, and finally, liberation. A reminder that even in the most fantastic stories, the most powerful themes are profoundly human.